In this video, I'm going to teach you all the pinyin initials and how to pronounce them correctly. Hi guys, welcome to MAO-MAODARIN. I'm MAO. So what is initials? Initials is one component of pinyin. And what is pinyin? So pinyin is a romanized phonetic system for transliterating standard Chinese in mainland China. And in Mandarin Chinese, Pin means spell, yin means sound, so pinyin literally means spell the sound. With the help of pinyin, you can look up words in the dictionary and teach yourself how to read those non-phonetic, squarish, and weird-looking Chinese characters. Isn't that cool? Except the initials, the pinyin system also includes the finals and the tones. But we're only going to talk about initials today, so initials in Mandarin is called shengmu, literally means mom of the sound. In this context, we can interpret mom as origin or beginning, so it means the beginning of the sound. Although most initials are consonants, we don't like teaching initials with the form of consonants. As you know, Chinese is not a phonetic language. In that case, our ancestors had to create some phonetic systems in order to teach themselves to be literate. But these systems are quite complicated. They needed to refer to two characters they've already known in order to learn a new one. Let me give you a simple example from one system called 反切法. One person wanted to teach himself how to read this difficult character. He had to extract the initial sound from this character, and the final sound from this character, and then put them together to spell the sound, rang. And since pinyin system was derived from these old systems, it makes sense to divide the sounds of Chinese characters into initials and finals. When I say we don't teach pinyin initials with the form of consonants, I mean schools don't teach kids consonants in China. But I'm going to teach you the pinyin consonants. I think learning consonants can be more conducive to the accuracy of pronunciation for non-native Mandarin speakers. We learn the pronunciation first as toddlers before learning pinyin, so we know how to extract the correct consonants and vowels from the initials and finals when spelling the sound. But it could be a little difficult for non-native Mandarin speakers. Before we start, I'm going to read all the 23 initials first and then pronounce them as consonants to give you a better idea. Here are the initials. Bo, po, mo, fo, de, te, ne, le, ge, ke, he, ji, qi, xi, zhi, shi, shi, zi, si, si, yi, wu. And here's how we pronounce them as consonants. The last two are a little special. They're actually semi-vowels. I'll leave you in suspense. Let's learn the 21 pure consonants first and discuss these two at the end of this video. Now let's get it on. First of all, we can remove 6 sounds. Because they are pronounced exactly the same as English consonants. Just one thing, did you notice that I marked 4 letters in blue? They are the only 4 voiced consonants in pinyin. Now let's look at and t. They're in the lowest difficulty level, and the only difference between them and their English counterparts is the vocal cords. Put your hands on your voice box and make sure it's not vibrating. Have you ever heard a Chinese person saying bug as bug? Because he didn't voice the b. And the other way around, I heard some English speakers saying 对不起 means sorry as 对不起, because they pronounce the as b, as d. 对不起，对不起。喂，对， 对不起 instead of 对不起. The next one I'm going to teach is k. It only has one subtle difference from its English counterpart, but I think it's a little more difficult than and. Before I show you the tongue position shifts that I drew, I want to clarify one thing, that as you can tell, my English pronunciation is not that standard. I just started to study the correct English pronunciation earlier this year after I decided to teach Mandarin. But my accent was not built in one day. It's been there for more than 15 years. I'm trying to remove it, hopefully, but it will definitely take a long time. That's why I spend a lot of time carefully comparing the differences between English pronunciation and Mandarin pronunciation. I think it's better to start correctly, because once you get used to it, it's very hard to change the way you speak. Just like me. Okay, to pronounce English, the back of your tongue is raised up all the way toward your throat and slightly touches your soft palate to create an obstruction to block the air. And then release a strong puff of air to make the sound. But to pronounce the pinyin, you need to make that obstruction a little bit forward at the intersection of your soft palate and hard palate. In order to do that, your mouth would spontaneously close a little bit. And then release air puff. But the difference is very subtle. For example, 看 means look or watch. 看 an 看 versus an 看. Almost the same. Now that you know the tongue position of k, you can practice another pinyin consonant. But this time, release a less strong air puff to make the sound. Put your hands in front of your mouth to feel the strength of this ear puff. And don't vibrate your vocal cords. That's another difference between k and g, other than the tongue position. I heard several English speakers pronouncing 美国, the US, as 美国. If they don't voice k, their pronunciation would be more accurate. 国 instead of g, 国 美国. In Pinyin, k are categorized in the same group because they are alveolar consonants. This is very different from the English glottal consonant, which is produced in the throat. So to pronounce the Pinyin, you also need to arch the back of your tongue, but this time make sure your tongue is not touching the roof of your mouth. Leave a small gap and then release air through your mouth. If you are pronouncing it correctly, the sound can be stretched like this. But make sure your uvula is not bouncing like this. It should sound very quiet. You can pronounce either k or k first. Hold the tongue position and then release air stream. So next time, when you try to greet to a Chinese person, instead of saying 你好, raise the back of your tongue to create the velar consonant. 好 你好. Now let's move on to our next three sounds. This group is called 平舌音 or 舌尖前音, literally means flat tongue sound or tongue tip front sound. As the name implies, to pronounce this type of sounds, we need to move our tongue tips to the front of our mouth and remain the rest part of our tongue in a neutral position. Let's take a look at s first. To pronounce its English counterpart, s, you need to either raise your tongue tip or the blade of your tongue up and approach the alveolar ridge without touching it to create a narrow channel, and then release a stream of air to make the sound. But to pronounce the pinyin, we raise up our tongue tip or the blade of our tongue approaching to the back of our upper front teeth, a little lower than the position for producing the English. As for the lips, look at me. Just spread your lips a little wide. If you listen to these two sounds carefully, s and s, the pinyin s sounds a little more screechy than English s. San means 3, s, an, san versus s, an, san. Again, the difference is too subtle to be distinguished. It's not a big deal if you don't want to change your pronunciation habits. However, things can be a little different for the next sound, s, because the Chinese F word starts with s, s, ao, cao. And people are more sensitive to these type of words, so it's better if you can pronounce it correctly. You may find s sound quite similar to s, but try to pronounce cao with s, cao, cao. It does not sound as screechy as cao, and that's the point. When it sounds like it's being squeezed out of your front teeth, it can convey an intense feeling of contempt. So what you need to do is to raise your tongue tip or the blade of your tongue slightly against the back of your upper front teeth to block the air. As the ear puff bursts out, it will create a noise. And don't forget to stretch your lips a little wide. Ao, cao, cao. The last sound in this group is s, and the only difference between pinyin s and s is whether you aspirate or not. Meaning if you weaken the air puff when pronouncing s, you'll get s. Or you can refer to z, not z, because z is actually a voice version of s. To pronounce them, you leave a small gap between your tongue and the alveolar ridge, but z and s are formed by completely stopping the airflow. Place your tongue at the position where you pronounce z, and then lower it a little bit to slightly touch the back of your upper front teeth. Stretch your lips a little bit. Now pronounce it, but don't vibrate your vocal cords. 再见 means see you later. 爱在再见 versus 爱在再见. Alright, let's move on to our next level. They are palatal consonants and are articulated with the body of the tongue raised against the hard palate. Let's look at sh first. It sounds quite similar to the English palatal consonant sh, but there are 3 differences. First, the lips. To pronounce the pinyin sh, you need to spread your lips a bit wide, like this, sh, instead of pushing them away from your face, as when pronouncing sh. As for the tongue position, producing both sounds require you to raise the middle part of your tongue towards the hard palate with a small gap to release airstream, but the sides and the tip positions are quite different. The English sh is produced with your tongue tip pointing down and pulled back a bit to avoid touching anything in your mouth, while the sides of your tongue are pressing against the inside corners of your top teeth, right? Shh. However, the pinyin sh is pronounced with the tongue tip placed behind your lower front teeth. I mean, it's touching the bottom of your teeth. Shh. Shh. But the sides of your tongue should not be pressed against your inner teeth. They may slightly touch the teeth, but should be very natural without any strength. Shh. Shh. 谢谢. 谢谢. 谢谢 means thanks. 谢谢. 谢谢. Don't pronounce it as 谢谢. Now that you know how to pronounce sh, articulate the next sound. Sh should not be a problem. The only difference is that this time you need to arch the middle part of your tongue a little more so that it can slightly touch your hard palate. And then you release an ear puff to gently break the obstruction formed by your tongue and the roof of your mouth to create a sound. There's one thing I want to point out. The way to pronounce ch and j are quite different. A lot of English speakers and Mandarin speakers are pronouncing them incorrectly. I'll give you 2 examples. Have you ever heard a Chinese person pronouncing Jack, Jim, or Jason as Jack, Jim, or Jason? And the other way around, do you still remember 再见? We just learned it. What does 再见 mean? 3, 2, 1. See you later. Okay, I heard a lot of English speakers pronouncing 见 as Jen. The difference between these 2 sounds is not only the vocal cords, but also the lips and the tongue positions. To pronounce ch, your tongue should not be moving like this. It should be always placed behind your lower front teeth. Ch, 见, ch, 燕, 见, 再见, 再见, instead of 再认. The last one in this group is ch, and the only difference between ch and ch is whether you aspirate or not. Just like the difference between ts and ts. Can you tell me which one is aspirated one? Ch, ch. Yes, ch. Many English speakers might pronounce ch as ch. For example, in the Disney Redux Mulan, Mulan has a superpower called qi, not chi.
The qi is strong, Mulan.
Make sure to place your tongue tip behind your lower front teeth. Now let's move on to our last group. They are retroflex or post-alveolar consonants and are produced between the alveolar ridge and the hard palate. Let's start with and this is our last voice consonant in Pinyin. There are two ways to pronounce this sound in American English. The bunched and the retroflex The way to pronounce the pinyin is quite similar to the English retroflex version, so we can form the sound based on the retroflex English. First, pronounce the retroflex English. Hold this position and then relax and lower the back part of your tongue. As your tongue muscle gets a bit relaxed, you'll feel the sides of your tongue are not pressing against your inner teeth as hard as when pronouncing Finally, slightly push your lips out like this. Now that the tongue tip stays at the same position and sound is made at the tongue tip, what makes these two sounds different? So by relaxing and lowering the back of your tongue, you're actually giving more freedom to your tongue tip so that it can narrow this channel a little more. If you don't know how to articulate the retroflex, you can also form this sound based on pronounce first, and then move your tongue tip a bit backward to the intersection of your alveolar ridge and hard palate. Next, slightly lower your tongue tip to avoid touching the roof of your mouth. Finally, push your lips out like this. Just remember not to move your tongue tip too deep inside, otherwise it will sound a little too much. Originally means sun, but these days if you say without any context, people will likely to interpret as another Chinese F word. So don't practice in public. Alright, next one. Shh. To practice this sound, all you need to do is to simply remove the voice when pronouncing You got it. Now you can use standard Mandarin to pronounce Shanghai, Shanghai, shang, Shanghai, Shanghai, Shanghai. According to your experience of learning these pinyin consonants, would you be able to guess how we pronounce sh and sh? Yes, to pronounce sh, what you need to do is to raise your tongue tip a little higher to touch the roof of your mouth, and then release an ear puff to gently break the obstruction. And the ch is an aspirated version of sh. Just enhance the ear puff a little bit. Finally, we can move on to our last two initials. They are a bit complex. The pinyin scheme only stipulates the usage of these two sounds, yet doesn't explain how to pronounce them, so there's some controversy over the classification and pronunciation of these two sounds. Let's take a look at the usage of these two letters first. This is a table of all the pinyin finals. I know they look like a lot, but when we learn them in groups, they are not that hard to remember. Alright, so the letter Y and W are used to replace the letter I and U when there are no initials in front of these finals. And the letter W is required to be added in front of the single letter U, while letter Y is required to be added in front of this letter I. These finals and all the finals start with this letter. Looks like U with a pair of eyes. And once Y is added, this little guy would go blind. And these are all the occasions that you would see Y and W in Pinyin. One reason of making this stipulation is to make the boundary of two syllables easier to be distinguished. So you may speculate, does Y equals to I and W equals to U then? Well, if you learn them as initials, you might be taught this way. E and U. This will not be helpful for your pronunciation. In order to figure out how to pronounce the letter Y and W, let's take a look at these three finals first. E, U, U. When they sit in front of another vowel in diphthongs, they become prenucleus sounds, and their pronunciation become very light and quick. Many pronunciation experiments have proved that these prenucleus sounds always overlap with consonants in a syllable. For example, this sound, biao, biao. Since the initial here is a labial sound that is made by our lips, if I do this, biao, I can almost remove the sound, biao, versus yao, yao. The Y sound has more friction than the letter I, right? It sounds kind of similar to the English phonetic sound, y. As for the letter W, the friction is even visible. Compare 错 with 我, 我. I kind of puckered my lips when pronouncing 我, 错, 我, right? It sounds kind of similar to the English phonetic sound, w. In fact, you may find these two sounds respectively correspond to and in IPA in some references. But the problem is that the IPA is only used as a standardized representation of the sounds of spoken language by providing each distinctive sound a letter, which means it is more like a phonetic notation for pronunciation suggestion instead of a practical pronunciation guide. So, and might not be precise. For example, let's compare the English phonetic sound y and w with Pinyin and for example, yang,
yang, yang,
yuan.
yuan, yuan.
What do you think? The Pinyin sounds to me a bit lighter than English y with less friction. Like if we consider the English y as an aspirated version, the Pinyin would be an unaspirated version. So I would suggest pronouncing the Pinyin with a little less strength than pronouncing the English y. Y. Now let's compare the Pinyin with the English w. Y.
Y. Y.
我.
我. Or.
I can hear a bit less friction formed by the lips, but the difference is very subtle, so I would say it would be fine if we just simply pronounce it as English w. But just so you know, a lot of people also pronounce it as The reason is laziness. In order to add a frictional sound, except using both lips, we can also bring one lip close to our lower front teeth to make the labial dental sound. 为什么 means why. In order to pronounce 为, way, we need to move our lips from this position to a. But by pronouncing 为什么, 为, just one movement. Wait a minute. Didn't you say there are only 4 voiced consonants in Pinyin? How about y and w then? Well, technically, they are voiced semi-vowels. That's all for today. If you like this video and think the content is helpful, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video to your friend who's also interested in learning Mandarin. Please! Thanks for watching. Bye! Yeah. Maybe that is why a lot of us might spontaneously raise our tongue a little higher to add more friction when pronouncing it is. It is.